Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, an icon of 80s gaming featuring an icon of 80s boxing. It's an uppercut of nostalgia for many that still has a following in the world of speedrunning. It began life as plain old Punch-Out! In the arcades, a version that nearly everyone seems to have forgotten, but it looked pretty amazing for 1984. The NES version that came out 3 years later though is the one that has endured, and in its own way is just as impressive visually, a graphical treat that pushes the limits of the console. Attaching Mike Tyson's name to the game's home release was the final masterstroke, ensuring massive success. Now, trigger warning, I'm terrible at this game. I don't know what I'm doing at all, really, and if you're one of those manly men who's just naturally good at Punch-Out!, well, the footage of my play may well make you vomit in disgust. If you want to watch someone who's really good at Punch-Out!, well, go and watch Summoning Salt. He knows what it's about, but I'm here to give you some insights into how it works, ready and willing for a rather in-depth look at this game. But before I get to the old 1-2 stick and move palaver, a quick word from today's sponsor, PCBWay. Yes, the one and the only, your one-stop shop for PCB manufacture, 3D printing, CNC machining, injection moulding, assembly, a whole range of services. If you're a fan of retro gaming, you'll know that messing around with the original hardware is tons of fun, and PCBWay has your back here with a whole load of ready-to-go retro-themed projects shared on its website. Like this custom Famicom multicart, which interestingly supports Castlevania 3, something that most multicarts cannot. And you'll be surprised at just how inexpensive it is to get going with custom PCBs. Prices start from $5, and with a $5 coupon for all new users, you might find your first project costs you next to nothing. Anyway, thank you PCBWay, hit up that link in the description if you'd like to know more. Every sort of PCB imaginable could be yours for a very reasonable price. And you know what, they genuinely are a very good company that I have absolutely no problem endorsing. Alright then, let's get to the meat of this and talk about Punch-Out's stupid clever graphics and those massive, gorgeously cartoonish opponents. That was what stuck out about the arcade original, and Nintendo did a really great job of translating that to their much less powerful home machine. These guys are huge, beautifully drawn, nicely animated, the frame rate never dips, and there's absolutely no flicker at all. This was something that plagued a lot of attempts at fighting games on the NES. This unlicensed game Kart Fighter is an extreme example, but it just shows how bad it could get. But not so with Punch-Out!, it looks amazing all the way through. So what's the secret? Well, taking King Hippo here as an example, probably the widest of all opponents, if not the outright largest, let's break up the graphics into the two elements that they are constructed from. On the left we have the Sprite layer. That seems to be what King Hippo and nothing else is drawn with, and on the right we have the background layer. Usually this is pretty self-explanatory, it's what the background is drawn with, but here it looks like it's a bit more than that. Little Mac appears to be part of this background layer too, which is an unusual state of being for the main player character. Also, it turns out Referee Mario is part of the background too, but I'll get onto that. This though explains how Punch-Out! Is able to have such gargantuan foes bearing down on the diminutive boxer without flicker. The background graphics are used to supplement the sprites. Sprites are, the same as backgrounds, made up of tiles, predefined blocks of graphical patterns that are 8 by 8 pixels. And individual sprites can either be one tile or two stacked on top of each other. I've explained this before in other videos, but it bears repeating. You can have at most 64 sprites on screen at once, and no more than 8 on any one scan line or horizontal row of pixels. Sprites are usually used to draw moving objects in a game, player characters, enemies and all that stuff, and yes, you can join multiple sprites together to make one large object. And that's how the opponents are drawn in Punch-Out. Lots and lots of sprites. In fact, those extra large leviathans are made up of 50 or more sprites sometimes, and King Hippo here is up to 7 sprites wide. That doesn't really leave much left over for drawing other things though, like Little Mac or Mario the Referee, at least not without causing obvious flicker, the penalty you get when you try to draw more sprites than the NES is capable of. Cleverly though, Punch-Out avoids this by using the backgrounds to draw Little Mac and Mario, and even more cleverly it avoids all the pitfalls that this would usually entail. As I've said, background graphics are made up of the same type of tiles as sprites, but as a grid covering the entire screen rather than a bunch of separate objects. Scrolling the screen would usually ruin this illusion, because everything would move together, but that's okay, this is a single fixed view. If your graphics don't fit exactly into 8x8 squares, you're gonna have problems with tiles overlapping. Unless you're only ever placing tiles on a single colour background like Punch-Out is doing here. You're also going to have problems with the number of tiles you can update per frame, limited by how quickly data can be transferred to the graphics chip. If you were trying to update the whole screen, you're going to have problems, but here the game never needs to update more than the NES can handle, so it works fine. You might wonder how Little Mac appears in front of the opponents if he's the background layer. Well, the NES allows you to set the sprite priority so that they appear behind the background, and that's just what's happening here. And it all works really well, large animated characters without flicker in a fast-paced game, something that on the surface the NES might not seem capable of doing. But there's more to the story than that. You see, Punch-Out is unique in the NES library. Like most later NES games, it uses an enhancement chip built into the cartridge to improve the NES's capabilities, but the one that it uses, the MMC2, is used by no other games at all. Yes, it's packing something rather different, and that was what was originally going to be what this video was about, how this unique chip gave Punch-Out its unique graphics. But that turns out not to be the case. The most impressive bit about Punch-Out, the huge opponents, is not dependent on this chip at all really, and the stuff that it does do is not quite so amazing. So what is the MMC2 for? Well, a big thing that it does is increase the amount of graphics data that NES cartridges can store, and improves how that data is handled. Now again, this is something I've gone over in previous videos, but in short, NES games were originally limited to just 8 kilobytes of graphics data for the whole game, or 512 tiles. Punch-Out though has a whole 128 kilobytes of graphics data, and not only that, the cartridge allows it to be accessed very quickly in 4 kilobyte chunks. The graphics chip can only deal with 512 tiles at any given time, usually split up into 2 banks, one for the backgrounds and one for the sprites. The MMC2 chip allows the NES to effectively swap in a whole new load of sprite data or a whole new load of graphics data, and we can see this happening here in this emulated debug view. This is very useful as it allows the graphics on the screen to be made up of very many more tiles than it would be otherwise, and Little Mac can face a load of massive enemies with a load of animation. You can switch from one set of tiles to another between frames that appear on the screen, but also, interestingly, you can switch up the graphics whilst they're still being drawn. We can see this in action in Punch-Out when the graphics switch from one set of tiles to draw the status panel and audience, then to another to draw Little Mac and Mario when he appears. But none of this is that special really, because other NES games did the exact same thing pretty much, in a slightly different way technically, but with the exact same result. Gradius here from 2 years earlier swaps out tiles to draw the status bar in the same way, alongside many more games in later years with similar tricks. In fact, I would say that 90% of what Punch-Out does, including its most dazzling giant, not least the mighty Iron Mike, could be done with another enhancement chip very easily. Like, for example, the MMC1 chip that Nintendo had developed earlier in the same year that Punch-Out appeared. But the MMC2 did have a particularly amazing feature. It could do things that no other NES cartridge could. It could swap out graphics mid-scanline. With the MMC2 chip, certain graphics tiles are used as trigger points. In fact, there are 2 in each bank, one for the background tiles and one for the sprites. If one of these tiles is drawn on the screen, the tile set in use automatically swaps out for another one, and you can swap it back with the other trigger tile. Other enhancement chips allow you to swap out the tile set as we've seen, but only between scanlines, so you can only change the tile set in horizontal strips. The MMC2 though potentially allows the screen to be split vertically very quickly and easily, a unique feature. So what is this feature used for in Punch-Out? Well, number 1, it's used for the "Get Up" text when Little Mac gets knocked down. Yes, that tiny message at the bottom. This tile before the message switches out the graphics being used from the tile set featuring Little Mac to one that has text in it so the message can be displayed. That's all it does. This is also used on the fight intro fixture screen, whatever you want to call it. The trigger here is used to switch from the bank of tiles with the text on the left side of the screen to the bank of tiles with the opponent character portrait on the right side. But only in the top half of the screen. It doesn't need to do it at the bottom because Little Mac's portrait is in the same bank as the text tiles. It's used in a few other places too, but to no greater effect really. The power of this enhancement chip could have been used to do a whole lot of stuff. Parallax scrolling maybe, detailed images with every tile on the screen being unique, many things, but it wasn't in this game. What little things it does use it for, well, it would be hard to recreate it exactly with any other enhancement chip, but I really don't think it would be hard to do something similar. I don't think you can really blame the developers for this though. They may have been already well into programming it when the MMC2 came along, maybe pushed onto them by higher ups at Nintendo, I don't know. But as I've said, this is the only NES game to use this mapper chip. No one else ever tried to do anything with it either, but let me circle back to that point in a moment. A couple of other things to note about Punch-Out. First off, a tiny detail, but in every fight you'll see a small pink or, well, opponent flesh-coloured dot at the very edge of the ring. This is Sprite 0, the 0th sprite in the NES memory, okay, the first starting from 0. And this is special because it's used as a sort of marker. You place this somewhere on the screen and the graphics chip can tell the CPU when it's drawn, allowing it to be used as a trigger for other events. It's used to trigger the tile set switch in many other games, the point when one lot of graphics is swapped out for another like we've already seen in Gradius, or to split the screen up into scrolling and non-scrolling parts like here in Castlevania. Why is it flesh-coloured in Punch-Out? Well, it can't be transparent, or just an empty sprite, it's got to have some coloured graphics in it for it to work. Usually in other games it's camouflage, but here I don't think the developers could do that. They couldn't hide it under the background because that bit of the ring is just transparent background colour, and they didn't have enough room left in the colour palette to make the sprite the same colour so it would disappear. What does the Sprite 0 trigger do here? Well, in the main fights it seems to do absolutely nothing useful at all as far as I can tell. I know this because I disabled the code that checks for it and nothing broke. It just carries on as normal, and I would guess this is a vestige of when the game was being developed, before the developers perhaps had the MMC2 chip, which makes it redundant in this part of the game. It is used in these cutscenes though to give that parallax effect. The Sprite 0 hit triggers the piece of code that splits the screen up into strips that scroll at different speeds to create the effect. Here though, the trigger sprite is hidden under the background graphics so it can't be seen. One other thing, why do Little Mac's gloves and shorts change colour when he steps towards the opponent, going from white to green or blue as the game progresses? What's happening? Well, it's referee Mario's fault and the NES's technical colour constraints. The NES can have up to 13 colours in total for the background graphics, but it's split up into 4 palettes of 4 colours, as you can see here in this emulator debug window. We've got one set of colours for the status bar, one for the audience and ring, one that just draws Mario's hat, with one left over for Mario and Little Mac. Little Mac's boxing outfit ends up having to be the same colour as Mario's shirt and his eyes when he's on the screen. When Mario makes his exit though, the colour palette can be swapped out for one that makes a bit more sense for drawing the boxer and his outfit. The developers must have thought that Little Mac's outfit changing colour was less disturbing than this alternative. I'm sure there could have been some other way of doing it, but I guess the developers thought that it wasn't worth the bother of finding it when the rest of the game works so well. This and the pointless pink dot, well, they maybe are a little bit stupid alongside the clever, but let's not be too harsh on the developers. They did an absolutely amazing job otherwise and created a truly fantastic and memorable game whilst working with all kinds of constraints that we just don't have today. And Punch-Out remains an undeniable classic that looks superb too, an impressive achievement all round, but one that doesn't really make good use of its advanced and unique enhancement chip. Why did no one else ever use this chip, being as it could do some stuff that no other NES cartridge could do? Well, actually, it kind of was used again, but in a slightly different form, and not strictly on the NES. Another 3 games released on the Famicom in Japan only, all developed by Nintendo themselves and using the MMC4 chip, basically a slightly improved version of the MMC2. Now, all 3 of these are decent games, 2 Fire Emblem games and Famicom Wars, the ancestor of Advance Wars. Later entries in both of these series would of course become much better known in the West. It seems like the MMC4 is used in helping to draw windows more than anything else. A shame that this unique tech didn't end up with any unique looking games. No one else ever bothered with these chips outside of Nintendo. Presumably they didn't see the benefit, especially with another of Nintendo's enhancement chips on offer to put in their carts, the mighty MMC3. This one was huge, tons of games used it from Nintendo and many other manufacturers too. It couldn't swap out tile sets mid-scanline, but it could do a whole lot of other things that games developers must have found more useful. Punch-Out wasn't the only boxing game on the NES, no surprise given its success, but there's 2 in particular that attempt to do the same thing as Punch-Out graphically, both by the same company. There's George Foreman's KO Boxing here, which, well, it's not that good of a game, but it does look pretty nice, and there's also Power Punch 2. This was for a while, I believe, developed as an official sequel to Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, but that was ditched either due to Mike's legal troubles or Nintendo realising that it was really terrible, perhaps both. It's Punch-Out in space and it's not all that good. Despite both of these games using a very similar approach to Punch-Out to draw the player and opponents with a mixture of background graphics and sprites, they both use, yes, the aforementioned MMC3 chip. Well, the end has to be here, doesn't it now? I've gone on long enough about one single game. I'm going to call this done. I could talk about the intricacies of NES games for hours, but I don't know how much patience you're all going to have for that. Probably not as much as me. Thanks to my generous patrons, your help is, as always, greatly appreciated, and if anyone would like to join them, that would be fabulous. There's a link below. So thank you very much for watching, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll say see you next time folks.